Is Ryan Bohl, Stratford Middle East and North Africa analyst. He's studied and lived in the Middle East while freelancing as a writer. His focus, culture, geopolitics, and the strategic trends of global actors. Stephanie poses some interesting questions at the end of her report. First and foremost, this question of whether or not this marks an escalation on both sides. Do you see it that way?
Well, to an extent, it does mark an escalation, but mostly within the political realm for now. This was a retaliation that the IDF live tweeted, signaling that they were willing to take these strikes out of the shadows and no longer deny them as readily and start to publicize them as they were happening. This is a very intentional message both to the Iranians and to the Israeli public at large that Israel is going to continue to assertively strike Iranian targets within Syria, as has been its pattern for some time now, but will be doing so in a public manner. That is something that's different compared to the previous year in which many of the Israeli strikes remained in the shadows.
And so the next obvious question, can this lead to an escalation in things in the region? And so what are the dangers of that?
Well, on the political side, we still have to ask the question of whether or not they are preparing for a strategic shift or if this is just political posturing for Netanyahu at home, who's coming under attack by his right-wing and nationalist opponents in the upcoming election. If it is a strategic shift, however, it does mean that Israel is accepting a higher risk profile and is more likely to accept riskier missions that may be subject to miscalculation. Very similar to what we saw in September, in which a Syrian air battery accidentally downed a friendly Russian reconnaissance plane. That created a new risk profile for Israel because at the end of the day, the Russians blamed the Israelis for launching the airstrikes that the Syrians fired back at. Those sorts of things can lead to an escalation that goes outside of the hands of military leaders inside of Israel.
So there are dangers there. The longest running newspaper in print in Israel is out with this op-ed piece, and the title is this: Israel and Iran are on a collision course in Syria, and the U.S. and Russia don't care. That's rather provocative. Do you think it's accurate?
I wouldn't say that neither side cares. The Russians certainly do not want to have a conflict between the Israelis and the Iranians within Syria. They would much prefer the two compartmentalize their conflict and find some means to mitigate the new strategic balance that does see Iran as a long-standing actor in Syria. The Americans are in the same position. They also do not want to end up in a position in which they have to referee between the Israelis or the Russians or the Iranians. While the Americans do want to see the Iranians leave Syria, they do not want to do so in a means that might accidentally spark a state-on-state conflict, at which point it becomes very, very hard for these great powers to control what happens from that point on.
Can either of these great powers exert some influence to change the dynamic?
It is very difficult and limited in many senses. The Russians are unable to ask the Iranians to leave. The Syrian government is unwilling to do so right now, especially because the Iranians remain an important backbone of their fighting forces against the still simmering rebellion, especially in Idlib. The Americans, on the other hand, can't convince the Israelis to simply accept an Iranian presence inside of Syria that tries to actively replicate the Hezbollah strategy in Lebanon that has created a powerful Iranian deterrent to Israeli action. And so there is a limit to what these great powers can do. They can, however, facilitate high-level ties and diplomatic means to diffuse situations, much as the September shoot-down of that Russian reconnaissance plane did not result in a great power conflict or a state-on-state clash. It simply moved into a diplomatic phase and a de-escalation.
How much of this do you think is in response to the U.S. move to withdraw from Syria?
The publicity around this strike is very likely to be in response to the Americans pulling out of Syria and, well, the announcement of them pulling out of Syria. Previously, the U.S. strategy was to stay in Syria as part of a means to pressure Iran to leave. That was reassuring to the Israelis. With the Americans pulling out on whatever timetable they choose, this no longer convinces the Israelis that they will be able to rely on the Americans to be a useful actor in removing Iranian power from Syria. So this is the Israelis broadcasting to the Iranians and to their own public that they will continue this strategy regardless of what the United States does in Syria from this point on.
Ryan, thanks so much for your analysis. Appreciate it.